our tradition in North Carolina is we're looking for a place to connect with you.
Thanks.
I play a game when I'm working.
Okay, so what are the advantages or the dividends of the language awareness program in the middle schools or the high schools, the elementary schools? Well, we think there's a number of them. Obviously, the linguists in this room feel that language variation is important and worth studying. And so part of that is, if we feel this is worth studying, then why don't the kids study this as well? Because we think it's important. And as Walt was saying, there's so much tied up in society, in language, that you can't really understand, what it is to be human without understanding what language is a little bit. And so and just the misinformation about language out there is worth confronting. Language history reinforces the significance of major historical events, things like the Trail of Tears. These kids, they're taught the history. They're taught, a little bit about the history of the language, because they pick it up along the way. But until you reinforce it with the language, then they don't necessarily put it all together on their own. It's also just important to understand that language analysis is really a scientific inquiry. We take for granted the fact that we all speak English with these regular patterns. You never have to learn how to say id or t or duh on your past tenses, but you just picked it up. But there is a scientific aspect to this that's worth studying, and I think we demonstrate that with that a prefixing exercise. That's a pattern that you didn't know before, and now you know. There's connections between language and culture, and I think all the videos show that very clearly. This last video, it's not about Ebonics. It's not about, it's about the culture, and it's about the connection of the language and the culture. It's much deeper than that. The last two, just confronting language prejudice and stereotypes, and then challenging linguistic ideologies. That's really our goal, and this is one of the tools that we have of getting in there and saying to people, look, language varies. Everybody speaks differently, and it's a wonderful thing. And there's a lot of really wonderful things about that. It'd be pretty boring if we all spoke the exact same way. And so we think there's a lot of stuff to do there. Okay, what considerations are we keeping in mind as we develop this program? Well, there's a lot of things. As linguists, we kind of take for granted some of this stuff because when we approach language variation, we have to do it on all sorts of different levels. We have to think, where does this language or this dialect fit within other languages and dialects? And so we have a global perspective. And then we look at the individual features of it, so we have a very sequential perspective on that language. And so we can't take this for granted. And when we present these things to teachers, produce materials to teachers to present to students, we can't take that for granted because people learn in different ways. We have to take into account things like student learning styles, teacher styles. And so we have all sorts of different ways of learning. So we try and have visual things, verbal aspects, inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, active things where kids are working in groups, and then individual reflection where they're working individually. So when we teach, we have a language journal that the kids write in a number of times, and that's one of the things that we'll be including different prompts for these language journals that we think are appropriate. Other things are a little bit less technical, but just as important. We have to come up with lesson plans for people who don't have linguistic backgrounds to be able to go into a classroom and teach this stuff. And that's really challenging. And to try and make it easier on the teachers, we're trying to mirror the lesson plan styles that you guys have to do. Things like learning outcomes and so forth. We're trying to come up with learning outcomes and objectives in the same sort of way that you were required to come up with in your own teaching lessons. And we're trying to integrate the audio and the visual and the multimedia support stuff to make that as easy as possible on you. And the same is true of evaluations. Early on, we had some people look at one of our curricula that we were working on, and they said, well, this is fine, but there's no answer keys. And so, oh yeah, we probably should include answer keys. That's maybe important. And then they say, well, everything is just a random number of questions, and we need to do these things in numbers of increments of 5 because they're easy to average. And so we said, oh, it's not a bad suggestion. So we're doing everything we can to bring it, to package this in a way that's as easy and as enjoyable to teach as possible, because we think it is extremely enjoyable, and hope you do too. Thank
you. Okay, we'd like to ask the first question. Who's putting anybody off by putting it that way?
We'd like to ask the second question.
Yeah, moving along here. Gert? I mean, I have a comment. If you take a look at the A prefixing exercise, in that first, in list A, number 1, you have building and building. One of the difficulties that Jeff pointed out is that lots of students, maybe some teachers, don't know those categories, such as really know them like verb and noun. In Patricia's bibliography, there's a number of good sources like Hudson and Wheeler that argue that these grammatical notions need to be formally taught. Unfortunately, teachers today are still talking about nouns. How do you guys define a noun? As a person, place, or thing? And that's been wrong for as long as there's been human language. And it's something that needs to be formally brought out, that these categories have changed. And these kinds of exercises they bring up are